The purpose of this lesson is to learn about Boolean logic, selection or if statements, single alternative versus dual alternative selection statements, relational or comparison operators, Boolean operators, combining operators, and how to do short circuit comparison. Most programming languages use Boolean logic to make decisions. Boolean logic is a subset of Boolean algebra and is typically used to reference things like and, or not. We use this to make decisions, and it relies on what are called truth tables. The things that we're going to be working with are conditionals and comparisons. These are statements made to see if something is true. Our programs typically make decisions on true statements. We usually don't look for things that are false. However, we could force the system to look at a false condition. So if I'm hungry, then I will go make a sandwich. That doesn't say that I won't make one if I'm not hungry. It just says that if I am hungry, then I make a sandwich. Now, I could turn that around and say if I'm not hungry, then I will not make a sandwich. And we can evaluate the false side, but we have to force it to do it. By default, the system always evaluates for true. We can use comparison operators, and we can actually evaluate two things at the same time. So I could say, if I am hungry and it is lunchtime, then I will go make a sandwich. So what that would do is, if it's not lunchtime and I'm hungry, I'm not going to make a sandwich. Or if it's lunchtime but I'm not hungry, then I'm not going to go make a sandwich. So what we need to do is we need to figure out how we're actually trying to perform these evaluations. Sometimes we need to manipulate our evaluation a little bit just to meet the needs of our program, but for the most part we're just simply evaluating to see if something is true or not. Alright, so we are going to use what are called selection statements, and a selection statement is once again used to see if something is true. We're going to require a comparison. It's going to be a Boolean operation, and we're going to make sure that at least one condition is true. So if I'm hungry and it's lunchtime, I'll go make a sandwich. Alright, so if I'm hungry, that's true because I'm hungry. But it's not lunchtime, so therefore I'm not going to go make a sandwich. Or let's say I'm not hungry. If I'm hungry, well, that's false. And it's lunchtime, then go make a sandwich. Well, I'm not hungry, but it's lunchtime, so I'm not going to go make a sandwich. So these are called if, then, and else statements. And essentially what these are is if something is true, then we're going to do something. Else, we're going to do something else if we're not true. So if I'm hungry, go make a sandwich. Else, meaning I'm not hungry, go outside. That's just all we're going to do, is come up with something else to do if the first conditional is not true. Alright, so we have these comparison operators. These are called relational operators, and these are going to be things like equals. Now notice in C# we use two equal signs. Not equals is going to be an exclamation point with an equal sign afterwards. We have less than, greater than, less than or equal to, and then greater than or equal to. These are the comparisons that we can actually perform. We're going to use those along with some logical operators, the Boolean operators, to do things like if this and this is true, or if this or this is true, or if this is not true. Then we can actually perform decisions. We're going to use these things called truth tables. Now a truth table, there's an and truth table and there's an or truth table. Alright, so I'm going to assume that I have two conditions. So let's go back to the example of being hungry and at lunchtime. Alright, so condition 1 is if I'm hungry. Condition 2 is if it's lunchtime. So if condition 1 is true, I'm hungry, and condition 2 is true, it's lunchtime, then the result is true, I'm going to make a sandwich. Okay, if I'm hungry but it's not lunchtime, then we don't make a sandwich. If I'm not hungry but it is lunchtime, I still don't make a sandwich. And if I'm not hungry and it's not lunchtime, then I don't make a sandwich. Now that's an AND table. What happens is an AND table, both of these conditions have to be true to get a result of true. In the OR truth table, this is a little bit different. The only way to get a false is if they're both false. Otherwise you get a true for everything. So if I were to say, if I'm hungry or I feel like eating, then I'm going to go make a sandwich. So if I'm hungry, okay, that's true, I'm hungry. I feel like eating, true, then go get a sandwich. If I'm hungry, but I don't feel like eating, I'm still going to make a sandwich. Or if I'm not hungry, but I just feel like eating, I'm going to go make a sandwich. But if I'm not hungry and I'm not feeling like eating, then I'm not going to make a sandwich. So they're subtly different, but an AND table, both conditions have to be true to get a true. An OR table, both conditions have to be false to get a false. Now, the reason that this is important is because we're going to start making decisions based on these ANDs and OR conditions. We can combine multiple operators together. So I could do something like, if I'm hungry and I feel like eating, like we just did. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use ands and ors and then nots. So if I'm hungry and it's not bedtime, then I can make a sandwich. So what we can do is we can perform all of these, and then the way the system will work is it will actually calculate or evaluate the first condition first. And then if that one turns out to be true, then it will go ahead and evaluate the second one. In an OR statement, it'll evaluate the first one, and if the first thing is true, then it doesn't bother looking at the next one. Okay, so what happens is, let's say I have two conditionals here. So if I'm hungry, or, which by the way, this is the symbol for OR, it's lunchtime. Okay, so if I'm hungry or it's lunchtime. Actually, I'm sorry, it was if I were hungry or I felt like eating. Okay, so if I'm hungry, if this is true, what will happen? In a short circuit comparison, if this is true, it will never evaluate if I just feel like eating or not. So what happens is when we place our conditions in our selection statement, we want to make sure that the one that is more likely to be true should come first. And the reason for doing this is if it's more likely for this one to be true, then it'll always evaluate this one and not necessarily look at this one unless it has to. But if it's more likely for this one to be true, then what happens is it's going to evaluate something that's false before it finally decides over here, okay, this one's true, so we're going to go ahead and do it. And so what happens is our program would actually run a little bit faster if we always evaluate the one that's more likely to occur first. I want to make some console applications to show how these work. And the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to make a program that just simply makes a decision if something is true or not. Alright, so what I'm going to do is, as the most basic, I want to make an if statement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if. And the way that you evaluate something is you want to evaluate if something is true or not. So I'm going to say if 3 is equal to 3. Okay, so here is my if statement. And my basic if statement is I only have to have one line of code after it, but I can have more than one, and I want to show you both ways to do it. So what I'm going to do is if 3 is equal to 3, then we're going to say console.writeLine it is true. Okay, so just simply evaluating these two numbers to see if it's true. Okay, so the question is 3 equal to 3? Yes, it is. Therefore, it should display it is true to the screen. Now remember, with our console applications, we also need to do a console.read at the end just so that our program doesn't go away and we can actually see the output. Alright, so I'm going to start this, and it says it is true. So what it's doing is it's evaluating, is 3 equal to 3? Yes, it is. Therefore, it will do this line of code. Alright, so what I can do is I can modify this a little bit. I want to display 2 lines of code if it's true. Well, the catch is if I do an if statement like this, it will only evaluate the first line of code that occurs after the if statement. If I want to include more than one line of code, then what I have to do is press enter, and I'm going to put this in a set of curly brackets. And so now what this does is it says if 3 is equal to 3, then perform all of the stuff that's between these curly brackets. So what I'm going to do is console.writeLine second line of code, just to show you that it went into this line of code. Alright, so if I run this, now we get both of those. But if I take 3 and if I said if 3 is equal to 2, then nothing. Nothing got printed because I told it that to only print those 2 lines if 3 is equal to 2. 3 is not equal to 2, so therefore it won't do it. Now I do have other conditionals that I can play with, so I could do something like if 3 is greater than or equal to 2, well that one should be true. So therefore it will allow us to have our 2 lines of code. Alright, so that's our basic if statement. Now I have what's called a single alternative here. And single alternative just simply means that I only evaluated if this is true to do something, otherwise we just don't do anything else. But what I can do is I can type the word else and it can have its own little section of code. So I can do something like console.writeLine, it is false. Okay, so 3 is greater than 2, so therefore it should only run this section of code. Now the way that an if-then statement works is if this is true, it will run this section of code. If it's false, it'll run this section of code down here. Now the thing is that the program can only run one or the other of these 2 sections of code. It can't run both because it's not possible for both of them to be true. Alright, so if I run this, we get the first 2 lines of code. We get the it is true and second line of code because 3 is greater than or equal to 2. But if I change this back to is 3 equal to 2 and I run it, now I get it is false because what happens is 3 is not equal to 2, therefore it ignores this section of code and it jumps down to the else section and it runs this instead. Now, C# does allow us to use keywords. We actually do have a keyword of true. So what I can do is I can force it to be true here. So if it's true, then do this console.writeLine. True. Okay, so I forced it. But I could also say false and then run this and it is false. So I can force it to be true and I can force it to be false. Or I could even go a little bit further. I still want to force it to be false. Well, what I could do is I could force it to be not true. And if I run it this way, it's false. So even though I typed in the code true, because I put the exclamation point first, that means not. So if it's not true, therefore it has to be false, then it has to do this section of code down here. So we do have different ways that we can force it to get into the true or the false side, but typically we're going to do some sort of comparison. And we're actually going to use variables instead of saying things like is it true or not true or things of that nature. Alright, so what I want to do is I'm going to make a section here of variables, and I'm going to make an integer value called int num1, and we'll set this equal to 3, and we'll make another one, int num2, and set it equal to 2. Okay, so what I'm going to do is if int num1 is greater than or equal to int num2, then it will perform this section of code. Alright, and it's true. The reason for it is int num1 is 3, int num2 is 2, 3 is greater than or equal to 2, so therefore this is true. We'll get into this section of code. But if I were to change this to equals, now we get into the false side because 3 is not equal to 2, therefore we go down to the false side of our selection statement. I'm going to modify this a little bit to make it a little bit more interactive. What I want to do is I want to ask the user to enter 2 numbers. Okay, so I'm going to do away with the initialization here. So we're still going to keep these 2 numbers. And what I want to do is I want the user to input 2 numbers, and then I want to compare the 2 numbers to see if the first number is bigger than the second one, or the second number is bigger than the first one, or if they're equal to each other. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I need to declare some variables. Okay, so this is our declaring variables. We have these as integers. I need string values for now, for strnum1 and strnum2. And then what we're going to do is we're going to ask the user for input Okay, so we're going to ask them to enter the two numbers, and then we have to convert the numbers to integers. Okay, after we convert those, then the next step is going to be to perform the comparison. Okay, so our comparison is going to be if the two are equal to each other, then we're going to write the numbers are equal. Okay, so now I have the ability here to say if they're equal to each other, then we write this. Else, we want to write this, but I actually have three possible scenarios. Okay, so I'm going to write this the long way, and then I'll show you how to shorten this a little bit. So if int num1 is equal to int num2, then we're going to write they're equal to each other. And I'm going to make a completely separate if statement. So if int num1 is greater than int num2, then we're going to say console.writeLine. The first number is greater than the second number. Okay, and then another completely separate if statement. If int num1 is less than int num2, then we're going to say console.writeLine. The second number is greater than the first number. Okay, so these are completely separate if statements. All three of these are separate. This will work, but the thing is it's not going to be necessarily the most efficient because it's possible to get more than one of these to run. Alright, so I'll show you in just a second how to fix that. Alright, so we're going to ask the user for the two numbers. So we're going to start off with a console.writeLine, actually console.write, and then enter a number. Okay, and actually I want to provide something to show that it's an input. Alright, so enter a number, and then we're going to read in whatever they type, and we're going to put it into strnum1. Okay, so strnum1 is going to be equal to console.readLine. So we read in whatever they wrote. And then we're going to do a console.write, enter another number, and then we're going to put that into strnum2. Okay, so we read the line, put it into strnum1, read the line, put it into strnum2. Alright, so now we need to convert the number. So we're going to take whatever is in str, which is a string, convert it to an integer, and put it into int num1. So we're going to say int num1 is equal to convert to, and we're going to convert to int32. What are we converting? We're converting strnum1. So just like we did in prior lessons. Alright, and int num2 is equal to convert.to int32 strnum2. Alright, so we're going to convert both of those strings to numbers and put them into the number values. Alright, so now what we can do is we can actually run this and see what the output is. Alright, so I'm going to enter 3 and another number, I'm going to enter 2. And the first number is greater than the second number. Okay, so let's do 2 and 3. And the second number is greater than the first number. Alright, and then we can do 3 and 3, and the numbers are equal. So it's working, but these if statements being three separate if statements is actually not a very good design. What I want to do, I'm going to change this just a little bit. And right here where I have this if, I want to change this to else if. And the reason for this is I'm actually combining these two if statements together into one if statement now. So if they're equal to each other, we're going to say they're equal. Else if the first number is greater than the second one, then we do this. And then the last one is going to be just simply that if it didn't match either of these other two, then it has to be that the second number is greater. Those are my only three possible scenarios for this. Now I could say else if and then have whatever listed there, but in this case I don't really need it. And then my very last one should always be an else, so I should have some sort of else at the end. And then if I run this, now what happens is they're all linked together, and what will happen is if it evaluates these and they're equal to each other, it only goes here and then it ignores the rest of these. It'll actually make my program run faster because it has less evaluations to perform. Okay, so now if I say 3 and 3, now they're equal. Run it again. If I say 3 and 2, first number is greater than the second number. And if I do 2 and 3, the second number is greater than the first number, so I get the exact same results. But the difference is that my program will actually run much faster because I have less evaluations for it to perform. In this lesson you learned about Boolean logic, you learned about the ands and ors and nots. You learned about the selection, which is also called if statements, and you learned about the single alternative and the dual alternative. That's our if and then else if statements. You learned about the relational comparison operators, so things like equals, greater than equal to, not equal to. Boolean operators, the and or not. How to combine operators, and then short circuit comparison. If we compare the more likely one to be true first, it'll make our program run much faster.